Your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
Welcome to the 182nd taping of the North Idaho College Public Forum. On behalf of our panel, it is going to be my very special privilege this evening to welcome you to part one of a two-part series with our guest. Our guest is Mr. Ralph Smead, and when we invite him to our program with past discussions, it became our opinion that he was so articulate and intellectual in defending a particular political philosophy that we thought you might be interested in a very long dialogue between our panel and our guest. So I'm inviting you to be with us this evening for this first part, in which we will be dealing with many political and philosophical issues, and then we will continue it next Saturday night at the same time in part two. As to background, Mr. Ralph Smead is presently a businessman living in Caldwell, Idaho. In addition to his business pursuits, he is an author and a writer, writing for such newspapers as the Lewiston Morning Tribune, the Idaho Free Press, and the Caldwell News Tribune. In addition to this, he is a member of the Association for the Humanities in Idaho. In the past, he has also been active in the Republican Party and served in the 1960s as a member of the Idaho State Executive Committee. In addition to all of his present duties as a businessman and a writer, he is also serving as president of the Center for Study of Market Alternatives with headquarters in Boise, Idaho. As the articulate spokesman for the Libertarian View, he is with us to discuss this evening and again next week. Mr. Smead, it's a great pleasure having you on our program.
Thank you, Tony.
I also am privileged tonight to welcome three of our regular panel members. To my far left is Mary Lou Reed. As to educational background, she is a graduate of Mills College in California. She also did work in religion or theology at Columbia University in New York City at the graduate level. Welcome back, Mary Lou.
Thank you, Tony.
Also this evening, Dr. Ken Wright is on our panel. He, as to background, is a chemist with a PhD in that field from the University of Idaho. At the present time, he teaches in the field of chemistry at North Idaho College and also serves as chairman of the Division of Physical Sciences. Dr. Wright, welcome back.
It's a pleasure, Tony.
And also it's my privilege this evening to welcome to our program Janelle Burke. As to background, Mrs. Burke has a bachelor's degree from the College of Idaho, and she also has a master's degree from Indiana University. She served as Dean of Women for 5 years at Idaho State University and now lives in Coeur d'Alene and is most active in many organizations, including the League of Women Voters. Welcome back.
Thank you, Tony.
We'll proceed to questions at once, and the first series of questions this evening will come from Mary Lou Reed.
Ralph, you call yourself a libertarian, and I think it would be helpful for us and our viewers if you refresh our memories. How do you define libertarian or libertarianism?
Well, Mary Lou, I really don't call myself a libertarian. It's a nice title, it's a nice label, it's like most labels, it's misunderstood. But I suppose it's meaningful. The word libertarian and the word conservative and the word liberal mean different things to different people. So does the word libertarian. But for lack of a better label and to try to respond to your question, I suppose you could roughly characterize the people who think that the word libertarian is a good word and don't mind that label, and I don't, but I suppose the first spokesman who formalized the idea, although not under that label, is Adam Smith, the Scotch moral philosopher, if you please. He's generally thought of as being an economist. But the ideas that are generally held by the libertarians, and they don't all agree, professing some interest in individualism, I suppose that's more than natural. But in Newsweek magazine, for example, the ideas that are articulated there on, I think, every third week by Milton Friedman, the Chicago economist, I'd say would come under the label of libertarian. I suppose Dr. Henry Hazlitt used to write in Newsweek. His ideas would generally come under that label. Or free market economics would be another label, although of course it embraces not only economics but a moral philosophy. So I suppose that's in the general area of the free market, the individual liberty, this type of thing.
Well, how do you differentiate your position from that of something like the ACLU, who are civil libertarians? Are you concerned about individuals' civil rights as well as free market? Is this something that is an area that you spend much time on?
Sure. The American Civil Liberties Union, there are several libertarians that belong. I'm not acquainted with a lot of them, but one of the all-time great libertarian experts, a professor of political economy at Wabash College, Dr. Ben Rogie, I know to be in fact, he's told me himself that he is a member of the American Civil Liberties Union. I don't think that you could characterize libertarians, generally speaking, as joiners. But I think they're friendly to the idea claimed to be pursued by the American Civil Liberties Union. It's my observation that the American Civil Liberties Union gives more lip service to the idea of believing in freedom, but then maybe we all tend to do this a little bit. It's my observation in discussion with one of the big shot ACLUers in Caldwell some months ago, when there was a lawsuit in Caldwell about the pornographic movies that are held and shown in Caldwell. It was a very controversial problem, and the mayor there took a very vigorous part in trying to do away with the movie there. So the thing wound up in a big lawsuit. They hired an attorney from Arizona who was a big wheel in the ACLU. During part of our discussion there, because I'd written a column, a newspaper column about the pornographic movie there, and that the general thrust of it for this purpose could be said to have defended their right to do this because they weren't forcing people to come and see the movie. And some of the tactics used to harass the movie people there, I thought, were inappropriate at least. But in any event, we had some considerable discussion. They wanted me to testify at the trial, and I said that I didn't want to be characterized as defending or favoring the pornographic movie, just their right to do it, and the fact that I didn't think that it was a problem that the government should be concerning themselves with. In any event, I asked this gentleman why it was, because he was so active and so vigorous with this ACLU business, why it was then, if people's liberty were really of a concern to them, why they didn't defend William Buckley in his trial with the American Federation of Television and Radio Artists, when they said that he'd have to join the union or else he couldn't broadcast. Hirsch was this fellow's name, this lawyer. And he said, of course, that he didn't know about it. But then, of course, I didn't buy that, and I said, oh, I think you do know about it. Most everybody knows about William Buckley's activities, and I might just add that William Buckley's ideas tend to be in the direction, from where we are today, politically at least, in a more or less libertarian direction. He doesn't call himself a libertarian, but certainly in the idea, or in the area of freedom of speech, he would go along with this. I think that his trial, I'm not sure that they've appealed, but in any event, the ACLU wasn't so active there in defending Buckley. My guess is because they don't agree with him. I think it's unfortunate. So,
but you feel maybe there is a kinship in concern, but not in emphasis with the whole idea of not legislating morality and not stepping on individual rights.
Well,
don't let me push it too far.
Well, but I think it's important. I mean, I think it's a good question that you ask, and I think there's a lot of intellectual dishonesty abroad in the land today, and unfortunately, I can't say that it's all members of the liberal or left establishment. But in this instance, I think that it could be said that because the liberals, if you want to use just the street sense of the word, liberals would tend to be more interventionist, calling for more government intervention and toward problem solving, express a great deal of concern about individual rights. but particularly in the area of politics, this is an intellectually dishonest area. But it's really kind of too bad, I think, because the ACLU have done really, I think, some yeoman efforts in this regard. It's unfortunate, I think, that they, like the rest of us, I suppose, they tend to think the wise men agree with them.
Thank you.
Dr. Wright.
Mr. Smead, we're dealing with a lot of labels, and we will be dealing with a lot more here tonight, and they always tend to be pretty vague, and we're going to talk a lot about philosophies, I'm sure, before the program is over. And since a couple of these labels sound very much alike, and I think that we may have an idea about the difference, but I'm wondering if you could attempt to clarify fairly succinctly the difference between a libertarian and a liberal.
Well, if we can generalize a little bit and not hold to one another too tight here, because these labels do genuinely, I think, in some instances mean different things to different people, but the liberal would tend to believe that it would have more faith, if you please, blind faith, in government problem solving. More in the area of, they kind of would like to have laissez-faire in the area of individual liberties and personal freedom and freedom of the press and censorship in this area of drugs and so on. While at the same time, to me at least, and I think to most libertarians, they see their position as being quite the opposite in the area of political economy, in other words, of economic matters. In other words, they want the government to intervene in the economy, but not in the area of personal liberties of censorship and freedom of the press and this type of thing. The libertarian would have you look for the good life in the area of having the government stay out of both the economy and the area of individual liberties to the fullest extent possible.
Would the libertarian basically favor the philosophy that the less the government does, the better, just the necessary minimal functions?
Yes, I think most, generally speaking, in the best tradition of Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, these fellows, in that group of the Founding Fathers.
So they would feel that the government's certainly necessary, but the less government, the better off we're all likely to be.
Yes, and I think should be understood that great numbers of libertarians are, some of them lean a little farther than others. They have the anarcho-capitalists, they have those followers of Ayn Rand, of Murray Rothbard. Some take a hard position on gold, for example, to keep the politicians honest. Some take a soft position on gold. Some, Murray Rothbard probably is you might say, the titular intellectual head of the people who believe in a more radical view. I don't know that anarcho-capitalism is just exactly the right word for Murray, but he's a professor of economics at Brooklyn Polytech. And such ideas as private police force and private fire departments and this type of thing, I think of a more or less radical nature. And I think that maybe if we're talking about these labels, all too often discussions like ours tend to not make it clear that about these definitions and these labels and so on. And I think in that regard that S.I. Hayakawa in California, the Japanese semanticist, has performed a real service. That was one of my first introductions a good many years ago to the fact that semantics plays a tremendous part in this thing. And I think that here, while it may seem a little tedious at first, but if our labels and if our meanings and definitions here aren't at least understood by one another, we don't have to agree on them, but we have to understand, I think, in order for any kind of dialogue to be at least a bit meaningful. And I think that all too often the television programs in particular are misleading the news media, whether it's out of ignorance or how much of it's malicious I'm unable to say, but has the same effect. The journalism schools, it seems to me, in the great universities and the lesser universities in America, I think, contribute in a bad way toward this. Present company accepted, of course, but probably. But in any event, I think it's important to, I don't want to personalize the idea to characterize the definitions, but I think it's helpful that because Milton Friedman is one of the articulate spokesmen of the libertarian right, and because he does write well, and he's a very dynamic and articulate person, so I think that while I don't claim the label libertarian, but the labeling seems to sometimes do more to confuse than it does to enlighten, but here, if we're going to use that word, there are real articulate spokesmen. I think William Buckley has done a great deal to establish the idea that the free market as a school of thought here for problem solving and for the preservation of a free society is not utopian. I think that needs to be in our little definitional book here if we can. But the socialists would tend to have their prejudices a little better arranged than people on the right. And I think that's one reason why the socialist idea is better understood today than the idea of the free market or private property, limited government approach. And I think it's to their everlasting credit that they've done a better job of their homework than people on my side of the fence. But again, just for clarification's sake, I think that it's helpful to get the idea of utopianism out on the table where we can deal with it, that the free market doesn't claim to be utopian, but the socialist school of thought does tend to be utopian, and I think it gives it a better emotional appeal, and I think that scholars on our side of the fence are becoming aware of this and beginning to grapple with it. I think that's helpful.
Janelle Berg.
Could we talk a little bit about the history of the last 30 or 40 years, the libertarian movement, or politics in general, the persons who were involved, particularly national leaders, the people who were involved, just throwing out some names, the Roosevelt, Taft, Goldwater, some of these people, the emphasis that they placed on the national politics and what this did to what their policies did to formulate ideas in the U.S.
Well, I think that's probably helpful, but it's also risky. Most of the young people today feel like that the world began with Franklin Roosevelt and his administration. And again, Roosevelt, you know, was elected to office under a campaign platform of getting the government out of business, of balancing the budget, of getting the government off the workers' backs. But you don't hear much about that anymore. I mean, in Roosevelt's administration and ideas and so on give a real spin to these ideas, and I think, again, to just exactly what accounted for his dramatic reversal, of course, is there's not complete agreement on that, but at least John Maynard Keynes, of course, was very helpful in giving an intellectual status to Roosevelt's interventionist ideas. But I think maybe that some perspective is called for here in the light of Franklin Roosevelt's administration. I'm not at all sure that Roosevelt was able to lead the people toward a balanced budget. I'm not sure he was able to articulate these ideas. I'm not even sure he understood them, but assuming that the political platforms don't have very much meaning, I got a kind of a bath about my education in politics. In 1964, I was an enthusiastic supporter of Barry Goldwater in those days, and I was a delegate to the Republican National Convention that nominated Barry Goldwater. And some of the things that Goldwater was destroyed with later on, his extremism in the pursuit of liberty and moderation in the pursuit of justice, this type of thing, I thought was a great statement, but the press virtually destroyed him with that. I think possibly partly because they didn't understand, they don't today. But again, how much of that's malicious, I don't know. But I thought at the time that Barry Goldwater was at last a breath of intellectual honesty that had finally come to the Republican Party, but it didn't. I think maybe that it could be fairly said that it wasn't so much the Democrats that destroyed Goldwater as it was the moderate Republicans. However well-meaning, I'm not able to say in each case, difficult to generalize, but it's helpful to use these people, I think, but we get into a kind of a personality cult, and I would just utter a word of caution just for that reason.
How much do you think the political party is a vehicle for an individual, or how much do you think it is the vehicle for an idea? In other words, how much do you think that you can do within the party as an individual to express your own feelings, your own desires, your own wishes about government, as opposed to following a leader, the party following a leader? How much does a party have to submit to the wishes of the majority in order to win elections?
Well, to the degree that politics, I'm not sure whether the political leadership is which comes first, the chicken or the egg, but it seems to me that you raise an interesting point. Steve Sims, for example, and Bob Smith and I used to publish a little publication called the Idaho Compass, and I guess maybe our main claim to fame was to get Steve Sims kicked off the presidency of the Alumni Association at the University of Idaho, because we were advocating, and Steve in his capacity as president of the Alumni Association, we were advocating a chair of capitalism at the university. We were advocating the contracting education of the School of Forestry and the School of Mines at the university, contracting that out to the Weyerhaeuser, Boise Cascade, or this type of organization, and that was the major thrust of the radical ideas that were promoted there. And this didn't go over very big. Steve made his first political mistake of asking for a vote of confidence because of the upheaval that caused. But you know, in a country that's supposed, at least gives lip service to believing in capitalism, it seems rather untoward that a university, and I don't blame this on the university per se, but to the extent that the alumni have some input to the university, and of course they do, at least can have from time to time do, they felt like that Steve had to, in the words of one of the board members there, said, "Steve, I admire your guts, but you're president of the Alumni Association, you've got to sell the stuff whether it's worth a damn or not." That's a quote. And some of the people who wouldn't give him an endorsement for his, or our, if you please, ideas, were conservatives. So it just, I just bring that up to show the confusion. Now, to get directly back to your question, we decided after that people were so hung up on political problem solving, including the universities, that maybe the way to sell ideas was through political effort. And in a horribly oversimplified way, that was the little embryo that started Steve Sims into politics. So I would have to answer your question with a resounding yes. Yes, that is a way. And of course, this is also the reason for the Libertarian Party, which was formed in Idaho last year. And they had, last week, had their presidential candidate, Roger McBride, in Boise, and that's exactly their intention. Of course, they claim to be out to win, but I think that most everybody understands that that's an educational endeavor more than anything else. But in any event, people are so hung up on solving problems politically that they will listen to ideas in a political context, whereas, I don't know, on a show like this, Tony seems to have done something with his show here to get ideas kicked around, and but it's a real risk because it gets in a real mud puddle, because most of the politics is a quest for power, which really doesn't have anything to do with the idea of selling ideas.
Ralph, if I may, I would like to tie up at least two things that I think are loose ends, at least in my own mind, before we move back to the panel and probably pursue another aspect of this. This discussion we've been having of conservatism and liberalism and also the libertarian position. You mentioned in your answer a moment ago that, as I understand it, the libertarian would be more likely to keep government out of both economic and civil liberties, and that liberals would become involved in the economic aspect. But is it not also true that liberals would take the position that at times the government should become active to actually protect the rights of certain individuals and civil liberties? I'm thinking of the South and the black people of the South and what the government has done both in the court and in legislation. So is this a further distinction between the liberal position and the libertarian, or am I in error?
Well, I think that something that's overlooked here, Tony, is the extent to which the rights of the black minority in the South was infringed and precluded by law. Now, it's pretty evident the impact. Now, the good that the federal intervention has done in the area of civil rights, I think it's a little early to say, but it's had a profound influence, and certainly some good has come of it. And certainly the blacks were entitled to not only a better shake, it was a devastating thing that was going on there, but the reason that the blacks were forced to ride in the back end of the bus, in the back end of the streetcar, was because it was a law. And it seems to me that there's a difference if the law is looked upon as a negative influence. It's one thing if it's looked upon as it becoming more in the last 30 or 40 years, particularly the last 20, as a vehicle to right wrongs rather than in a negative influence to hold down violence and so on. I think that that we run the risk here if we just look to the law only. In other words, what happens now if some wrongs have been righted in the South? But what happens now if we use the federal law? Now, the state law didn't seem to be satisfactory, but it was looked upon as sort of an undefined thing in the South. Not that the state laws were bad, but that somehow in an undefined way the federal people had to come in and they were good and the state people were bad. But there were a lot of people, a lot of white people in the South that were not in favor of the treatment that the blacks were getting there. And it seems to me that to remove these laws is one thing, and I'm 100% in favor of that. But then to go farther now in this leveling thing that we seem to have going on by virtue of the hand of the courts and the legislative halls now, to go in and compel people to be equal is quite another thing, and I think that needs to be in our little frame of reference if our discussion is to be any good. And it seems to me that a lot of good has been done all right in terms of removing the legislation that infringed on the rights of the blacks in the South. And if that's what you mean, whether that's a good thing, I certainly think it is, but whether the law has a negative influence or a positive influence is quite different.
I think you've been very clear in making this distinction that should have been in the question, that is, it was state action by law that was causing discrimination, and it was federal or national action that attempted to change that. May I pursue this one step further and ask you, do you believe that in the area of civil and political rights for minority groups and for women and others that have been finding themselves both economically and politically somewhat in a more difficult position than we men oftentimes who are white Anglo-Saxons, do you believe if you do remove government completely from this area that the discrimination will be somewhat lessened, or will, in other words, I'm trying to say, will the citizens themselves take care of the problem? Or how do we still protect those who might be in somewhat a weaker position for one reason or another from discrimination with no government involvement with either positive or negative law?
Well, it seems to me that that discrimination, of course, it's a trigger word, and it raises the emotional hackles on quite a number of people, and I hesitate to use it, but it's a good word, and it seems to me that we ought, if we're to preserve a free society in any meaningful sense, in any broad sense of the word, that we ought to preserve the right to discriminate. Now, if you mean by discrimination the overt act of precluding people from what we accept, let's see, at least as far as whites are concerned, it's one thing, but if what happens now, if the federal law now has come along, and for good or ill, or both, as a matter of fact, in the South, and this rights thing is, at least it's out on the table, and as one of the all-time great libertarians, to my way of thinking, was a professor and founder of the Institute for Humane Studies in Menlo Park, California, Dr. F.A. Harper. His friends called affectionately Baldy. Baldy said to me one time, Ralph, as bad as the civil rights thing has been, we need to recognize that at least now we can get a discussion about it, and 10 years ago we couldn't. And it seems to me that the risk that we run here, that we haven't come to grips with, is what happens now when we use the federal intervention to discriminate. Let's say that we would agree improperly. Who do we appeal to then? I mean, we went from state law, went to federal law. Do we appeal to the United Nations, or what do we do then? And it just seems to me that if we don't preserve the right to discriminate against redheads, or to discriminate against Irishmen, or college professors, or whoever, if we don't like some of the college professors got way too much hair, and I think us bald-headed fellows have to have the right to discriminate against those. If we want to have a club and just want to let bald-headed fellows in it, I think we should have that right. So I think that the right to discriminate is something we should preserve. Now, to make it illegal to join a club of college professors or a club of anybody else, this and other things, why I think we need to preserve the negative aspect of law, and this idea of positive, I think that we get carried away with. I don't know whether I've answered your question, but it seems to me that discrimination is a good word as well as a bad word. We want to discriminate between merit and the lack of merit. I think we'd probably agree was a good thing. And I think we need to discriminate between thrift and frugality and industrious activity and honesty. And on the other hand, they're opposites. I think that we need to preserve that. And this today, that we just go off here with utter abandon that the word discrimination is totally bad. I don't think that's necessarily what you might have had in mind, but it seems to me that if I don't want to sell my house to some member of a minority, that ought to be my business. But to have the law enter into, make it illegal for anybody to buy or not buy, that's quite another thing. I'm not in favor of that at all. I would hope that we would get off of this kick that we're on about passing a law for everything. I think it's beyond comprehension that they just pass laws like there was no tomorrow, both in, not only in Washington, D.C., but in Boise. They're down there at it now, and I'm scared to death. Whenever I go over there, I've been over there twice, and both times I urge my friends over there to submit a motion to adjourn, because if they start now, maybe they'll get adjourned on time. I doubt it. But it just seems to me that what we've got to do is to use the marketplace more and the legislative action less in order to do this, and have people with their voluntary actions solve these problems.
Mary Lou Reed.
Well, actually, Ralph, this is just another way of putting the question, but you talk about the free society, and I'd like to have you sort of explain the emphasis on freedom, and what do you really mean? What kind of freedoms do you want? Do you want the freedom to get rich, or do you want the freedom just to not be told what you're going to do? What is the basic thrust of the emphasis on freedom?
Well, the French word that we use quite a lot, laissez-faire, pretty well describes it. to be let alone. There's a lot of liberals and conservatives both that would just like to be left alone. Not everybody wants to get rich. And of course, like Benjamin Franklin said, that most people can't stand prosperity, but then most people don't have to. I think the same thing applies a little bit farther here. Abraham Lincoln, as you no doubt remember, made some statement to the effect that this country is sadly in need of a definition for the word liberty, I think he used instead of freedom, but then they're used, I think, interchangeably, and I think all right. But we really don't have too good a definition of the word freedom. The question you ask, I think, is altogether fitting and proper. But as we were talking about earlier in the book Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, now the liberals push this book, and you know, again, they got to jump on us. I think it's to their everlasting credit. It's an absolutely great book. But to my way of thinking, the expression here of freedom means one thing to one person and something else to another. I think that's all right. I just think if one fellow wants to be a beachcomber and he doesn't bother anybody else by his beachcombing, I think that's great. And if he wants to build a better mousetrap and get rich doing it, you know, like Henry Ford, and leave his money to a foundation that believes almost 100% opposite to everything he believed in, I think he's probably spinning in his grave now. But nevertheless, he had the privilege to do that, and unfortunately it was a tax gimmick. That part's the bad part about it. But it seems to me that the word freedom is badly in need of a definition, and I think as we go along that it would be helpful to maybe redefine that as...
And in many ways you do want, though, freedom from regulation. And my question in this regard is it possible to avoid the conflict between freedom and order when you get too many people? Is this not what we're running into now? Can you have this kind of freedom in anything other than an expanding society, something like the Wild West, where you had lots of room and people didn't run into each other, you know, elbow? Do you feel that are you concerned about the fact that it's hard to maintain these freedoms with the growing number of people?
Oh, it's hard, all right. But, excuse me, of course we're so preoccupied with rights now that very little's ever said in the press or in the news media or in television about responsibilities, and that's really what you're asking. And oh yes, I'm very much concerned about it, and I don't have a real pat answer for the problems there. But I think that one of the things that might respond to your question, it seems to me that maybe during the days of the founding fathers in the 1700s, particularly around the times of the Revolution, that it may have been that there was a sufficiently small number of people that the federal government then could maybe have directed all of our affairs like Big Brother seems to want to do today. They may have been able to because of the small number of people, but I think the problem here is quite the opposite that what is generally considered today. I think the more people there are today, I think is a condition that calls for less government and more individual decisions. I think that it's presumptuous and becoming more and more evident every day now that the federal government is less capable than even some of us extremists thought to direct the affairs of people. We just pass laws every day just like there were no tomorrow. And the idea, I think, that our citizens can understand what the law says, let alone comply with them, I just think is just not rational. All I'm saying, I guess, Mary Lou, is it's quite the opposite thing. I think the more people we get, given an understanding of freedom, given some understanding of private ownership versus public ownership, which I think the great issue before us is I think that's what the issue is. Ludwig Mises, for example, the great Austrian economist, has made that, I think, abundantly clear that the issue that we're facing here, and although it doesn't get discussed in this light, is public ownership versus private ownership. And there are two ways to hold title to property. One is for the state to hold it, and the other is for individuals to hold it. But the idea that isn't understood today is the connection I think between private ownership and some moral value called freedom, or the moral aspects of it, it just isn't understood. It isn't discussed in the colleges. It isn't discussed in the opinion-molding circles today. So it's a big problem that you pose, all right, because it gets to be more and more people. But I think that calls for less government, all right enough. But I think it does call for a better understanding of one another's rights and responsibilities, which we don't seem to have.
And you're suggesting that you could substitute a sense of responsibility for private property and each other's wishes for governmental regulations. Is that what I'm hearing? The
Yes.
assumption of responsibility is an alternative to regulation?
Well, sure. This is the thing that divides me from the people that tend to call themselves anarchists. Because even the anarchist position, and I don't use that in a bad, I think that the anarchists they've got something that we ought to listen to. We listen to the communists, and I mean the small c communists today, and try to understand them. But not much is given to trying to understand the anarchists. And I think that their idea presupposes a certain common understanding of one another's rights around some idea of private ownership. But the moral aspect of private ownership, the people on my side of the fence have not done a very good job. And I suppose one of the reasons is that maybe we take ourselves too seriously, because the people on, let's say, your side of the fence, if I can say that, I think are as well-meaning as people on my side of the fence. But you folks have done a better job of selling your ideas than we sold ours. But and you have more fun at it. But we're beginning to have a little more fun, and you better look out.
Dr. Ken Wright.
Mr. Sneed, Tony Stewart's always playing the devil's advocate on this program. He frequently assumes that role, so I'll assume the role of the CIA investigator, since they're in the news these days. I'd like to delve into your personal life a little bit. From Tony's introduction, it's pretty obvious that you are a man of varied interests and talents. You're a businessman in Caldwell. That's right, isn't it?
Yes.
And you're a journalist. You write columns for a number of newspapers. I don't know how regular you do this, but fairly regularly, I believe, isn't it?
Well, that's weeklies, when I don't make the fellow down at the Lewiston Tribune sore at me. they use my column, but but I think this journalist definition, you see, needs to be. Not all the journalists see things alike either, but the tendency is for the journalists, if I can use a word in the popular sense, own the media nowadays lock, stock, and barrel. So their idea of telling both sides is to find two liberals who disagree. So when you use the word journalist with me, I'd like for you to re-emphasize the fact that as a journalist, I was Bill Hall, one of the flaming liberals. I don't know just what Bill's label would be today, but when he was editor of the Lewiston Tribune, it was at his suggestion that I start writing there, and he said, "We'll carry your column, Ralph, and we'll just print anything you write so long as it isn't dull." And that's fair enough. I really take my hat off, and while he didn't do that every time, but for the most part he did. But you don't find very many conservatives asking liberals to write in their journals, and I think it's to his credit, and to the credit of his boss, Butch Alford. But you know, I just think that well, maybe I answered your question. I hope I did.
Well, maybe you might rather be called a writer than a journalist. Maybe that might be a better, more appropriate label.
Well, but in any case, in the good sense of the word, I try to express, and I'm sure that's what their idea was, that whether it was to sell papers or whether it was to give equal time to the gentleman of the right, as Bill Buckley would like to call people on our side of the fence, I'm not sure, but I don't think it's important. I hope his motive was selfish, but I think it was enlightened, and I enjoy writing there and to give some free market ideas, some ideas of individualism as opposed to the ideas of collectivism, which seem to be most paramount in our land today. Why, I enjoy that opportunity. I enjoy writing. It's more of a burden in some ways and less of a burden in others. But I think that in the journalism school, in the journalism business, generally speaking, there's getting to be a little bit more of that. I'm sorry that it isn't because of something that I promoted, and I'm sorry that isn't something that because of other libertarians and right-wingers that have promoted this, but Daniel Moynihan, for example, I think has done a great deal to give vent to the conservative school of thought and partly to the free market school of thought. So I'd like to take a little more credit than I think I'm able to for fellows on our side of the fence, but we're getting to be a little bit more articulate. Like I said to Mary Lou a little bit ago, we take ourselves pretty serious, and we're going to survive that and start to have a little fun. And so I think that, generally speaking, the press is, I think that at the risk of using the labels here, I think that Spiro Agnew did a lot of good in this regard. I think that he came down on the press real hard. And I think that the press needed this. And while he doesn't get any credit for it, and of course he got his hand in the cookie jar and got caught at it, and I'm not trying to excuse that, but I do think that the press is a little bit more responsible now than they were, and I think that there are other people writing now. My main claim to fame in Idaho writing as a journalist, as you call it, is that the competition isn't very tough. There's just not anybody else doing it.
Well, I'd like to probe on a little further, if I can. You have been active in the political arena, at least as a campaigner, and you certainly are heavily involved in education. In fact, maybe that's the thing you're most interested in. I'm not really sure. But I'm wondering if you have any political aspirations of your own.
No. Excuse me. No, I don't have, but yes, oh yes, I was active in politics, and I gave up as it became more and more evident that politics was part of the problem rather than part of the solution. It seems to me that that partly stems from, again, the academicians, that you fellows ought to kind of look in the mirror a little bit, and your contemporaries. That doesn't happen to you. That doesn't apply to you chemistry professors so much. But I said to Tony Stewart here one time, we were visiting a little bit, that I thought that part of the problem is that they separate the discipline of political science from economics. And in my view, that's what political science is all about, is how to gimmick the economy. And one of my political science professors, a great pal of Frank Church, who now lives in, formerly at the College of Idaho, Janelle will be acquainted with Dr. Wolf, political scientist of some eminence. He and I have some great conversation now. We used to be, well, we're still political adversaries, but now then I enjoy Dr. Wolf. But I used to tell him that how can you take such an interventionist position as you do when you know that you're just going to bankrupt the country with that kind of an idea? Well, we'd get into an economic argument right away. Oh, and he'd say, but Mr. Schmidt, he said, I'm abysmally ignorant about economics. And he'd define me out of the argument. Well, that's what politics is all about. I mean, politics is about political science, you know, how to get power, how to accomplish something by ramming your ideas down somebody's throat. So, all too often the Republicans are about as bad as the Democrats. Maybe they're not as bad because they're not as good at it, I'm not sure. But in any event, I am interested in education, and I think that's where the problem is.
So you're a little bit disenchanted with the political battlefront right now, and are more concerned with the educational.
That's the understatement, probably, Tony, of this little tete-a-tete of ours. That probably is the understatement of the whole works. Yes, I am disenchanted. However, I'm not sure that it's as malicious as I once thought it was. Part of it's out of ignorance. Maybe part of it out of stupidity, but most of it out of ignorance.
Politics.
Yes. Mm-hmm. These guys down at the legislature, you know, they're busily engaged in how to tell the people in Idaho, you know, trying to save them from themselves, and they're licensing this group and licensing that group and making the standards tougher, you know, and compelling people to be moral, and my goodness gracious, they're passing laws just like mad. And I think for the most part, most of them are bad.
Janelle Burke.
Your suspicions are confirmed, Mr. Smead. I did indeed get my first indoctrination in a variety of political theories from Dr. Wolf.
Well, I'm sorry about that.
I think your suspicions were confirmed. I did want to ask you, there are a number of new ideas. You have expressed your concern about the number of laws that are being passed and so forth. What do you think is going to happen in the future? Because really, right now, there are some new ideas. There is a new approach on the part of some liberals, such as Jerry Brown. There's a new approach on the part of some conservatives, a neoconservatism kind of thing that maybe you would fall in line with. Where do you see these things going in the near future as far as our country is concerned, as far as our state is concerned? In the State of the State and State of the Union messages, there's been sort of a tightening of the belt, a new approach to some of these things. How would you look at them, kind of giving a bird's eye analysis of the situation as you see it and where it's going?
Well, you mentioned Jerry Brown. I think that's a very apt example. I cut out an article quoting Jerry Brown some few months ago and sent it to my friend Steve Sims. I told him, you better tell the Republicans in Washington, D.C. that they better get on the ball while they're appealing to the moderates. Jerry Brown and the liberals are going to steal our stuff, and they're going to sell Adam Smith and take credit for it. So yes, I think that there's a lot of ideas. They're not so new, though, Janelle. They're new in the sense that you mean it, I suppose, because the news media hasn't seen fit to give vent to these ideas very much. You see Meet the Press and Face the Nation, for example. And they tell at the beginning of each one of their shows about this famous award-winning show that's just, oh my, the liberals just give awards to one another to beat the band. And this unrehearsed show, they say. And, well, again, I say that for the most part, some significant exceptions, but for the most part, they find both sides out here, and they find a liberal to represent each one. And I think, for example, on Meet the Press, which in my view is the better of the two programs, since there's a tiny bit of balance on Meet the Press, and I don't see very much on Face the Nation, but again, once in a great while they do. But I think these ideas that you talk about, that we're indebted, I'm sorry to say, to liberals again. If the liberal gets a good idea, why, somehow or another, it's big news. But if Milton Friedman comes up with an idea, let's say he comes up with some lousy ideas too, but he comes up with the idea about the voucher system, for example, for education. A little bit like the GI Bill. I'm sure you folks are familiar with it. For the benefit of the viewers who haven't caught that, because it doesn't get very much play in the press, this is a scheme a little bit like the GI Bill to give vouchers to people who have children eligible to go to school, and they can spend that voucher at any school they want to, public or private. And to expand the idea of freedom of choice, well, this is something that's been revived by Milton Friedman, and he's an extremely articulate fellow, and a charming guy, and a great guy, and a real good friend of mine, I might add. But you know, he also come up with the idea of the withholding tax and indexing, which scares me to death. But what did the government do when the idea of vouchers finally got out on the table? Incidentally, I should add that Adam Smith had this idea too, so it isn't really new. But the government decided to have an experiment. So at 3 different locations, 3 large cities in the United States, why they had an experimental program to discover whether or not the voucher system had any merit. And who did they get to head up the program but a big shot liberal, Christopher Jenks. Now, he may be a grand guy, I don't happen to know him, but when you say these new ideas that are here, you see it makes a difference in who it is that's endorsing these ideas. And all I'm saying is that I think that we're indebted in many cases to guys like Patrick Moynihan and to Jerry Brown, the governor of California, because they are doing some things with these things, some things that we should have been doing on our side of the fence earlier.
Do you think the times are calling for these kinds of actions? Do you think this is what's making politicians agreeable to them, making them
No, I don't know that the politicians are agreeable to them. The public opinion has a tendency, you see, when it does anything right, to ram ideas down the politicians' throats. And I think the politicians are more interested in power, it seems to me, than anything else. In too many cases, not every case, and a lot of good, sincere guys, but their idea, you know, is to have a benevolent dictator, and most of them look in the mirror and see the only one they think they can trust, and they work night and day to try to bring about their idea of utopia here. But I do think that that Jerry Brown is making a real case, and now he was elected as a liberal in California. Now I don't have any rationale for this, but I don't think that you could say, though, that to answer your question, is it the Times that's calling for it? No. The Times have called for it for years and years and years and years. But maybe the free market, maybe the freedom idea really is an idea whose time has come.
Ralph, we are running out of time for this first part, and you'll be back next week in about the 1 minute we have left. Would you give me a quick answer on, can you perceive in the future, a few years ahead in the near future, that there might possibly be a marriage between libertarians and new liberals, at least in some areas within Congress and the national level, or even the states? Do they have some areas now that are so common that they may work together in a coalition, at least in certain areas, maybe not in economics, but other areas?
Oh, yes, indeed I do. Yes, as a matter of fact, if the fellows on my side, if the fellows, forgive me, if the persons on my side of the fence that are interested in liberty and individualism are to get any ideas sold at all, I think we'll have to make a coalition with the left, because they're so much more articulate than we are. But yes, I think this marriage is, well, at least this courtship is red hot at the present time.
Okay. With that, we're going to bring our program to conclusion, and I thank you so much for being with us, Ralph, and we are looking forward to next Saturday evening, when again you'll be returning for part 2, and in that program we want to pursue certain things in relation to economics and the presidential election of 1976 and certain philosophies that are worldwide and organized religion. Ladies and gentlemen, may I end our program with a quote, as I do these days. This comes from David Grayson, and I think it's appropriate for our subject tonight. He said, and I'm paraphrasing, "Commandment number 1 is let people be different." With that, I'll bring our program to conclusion and thank our guest, Mr. Ralph Smead, for being with us, and our panel for their outstanding questions. And ladies and gentlemen, again next week, our guest will be Ralph Smead, and we'll be interviewing him in continuation of this particular topic. Until that time, I wish you good evening, and be with us at 6 o'clock next Saturday evening. Thank you.
The North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at this same time each week over this station. The preceding student production was brought to you by videotape recording. North Idaho College political scientist, Tony Stewart.
Welcome to the 183rd program, our taping of the North Idaho College Public Forum. As I told the viewers last week, this week it was going to be our privilege to have part 2 in a series with Mr. Ralph Smead discussing the libertarian view, economics, and all aspects of political philosophy, and also religion. Mr. Smead, it is certainly a pleasure on behalf of the panel to welcome you back for part 2 in our discussion.
Thank you, Tony. It's my pleasure.
Ladies and gentlemen, may I give you Mr. Smead's background. He is a businessman located in Caldwell, Idaho. In addition to that, he is a journalist writing articles for the Lewiston Morning Tribune, for the Idaho Free Press, and the Caldwell News Tribune. He is also a member of the Association for the Humanities in Idaho, and in the 1960s was most active in the Republican Party in Idaho, serving on the State Executive Committee. In his endeavors as a libertarian and discussing political philosophy, he serves presently as the president of the Center for Study of Market Alternatives, located in Boise, Idaho. It is also my privilege this evening to welcome back the same panel members that we had last week to continue their questioning of our guests. To my far left is Mary Lou Reed, who has a bachelor's degree from Mills College and then did graduate work in religion and theology at Columbia University in New York City. Welcome back, Mary Lou Reed.
Thank you, Tony.
Dr. Ken Wright is also with us again. Dr. Wright has a PhD in chemistry from the University of Idaho. He presently serves in the capacity as a professor of chemistry at North Idaho College and serves as chairman of the Division of Physical Sciences. Dr. Wright, welcome back.
Thanks.
And to my immediate left is Janelle Burke, who, as to education, received a bachelor's degree from the College of Idaho, a master's degree from the University of Indiana, and she was 5 years the Dean of Women at Idaho State University. She now lives in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho with her family and is most active in our community in such organizations as the League of Women Voters. Janelle, welcome back.
It's a pleasure to be here, Tony.
We'll proceed to questions in the first series from Mary Lou Reed.
Ralph, before the program, you said something I'd like to ask you to clarify. You said that you believe that there is no distinction between a human right and a private property right, and that you cannot have a human right without a private property right. I didn't really understand that, and would you expand on it, please?
Well, if I said that there was no distinction, I didn't mean to to say that. What I meant to say... I
misunderstood.
Well, to use Buckley's term again, a gentleman of the right, have been beat over the head and shoulders for years with this motorcycle chain, that you fellows don't believe in human rights. You think property rights are superior to human rights. And to my way of thinking, that's a phony argument, because a human right without a property right doesn't amount to very much. That's what I meant to say, that, for example, if a person spends his time, be it large or small amount of his life, to accumulate something, let's say a house, a lot, a farm, his home, his camper, or whatever it is, his automobile and his possessions, and he's not entitled to keep those, to dispose of, to use as he sees fit. Of course, so long as he doesn't harm somebody else in their peaceable possession of theirs. Certainly his human right doesn't amount to very much. That's what I was trying to say.
So I would have misunderstood you. You did not mean that someone who does not have property is not deserving of special rights. That you aren't really saying that all the rights go to the people who have things.
Oh, indeed, I didn't mean that. No, I didn't. But the whole idea, the whole argument, the whole dialogue, if you please, centering around the argument, human rights versus property rights, to my way of thinking, is a phony argument. No, many people, I think, are supremely happy owning very little, clothes on their back, maybe a bed or something, as I spoke earlier in the other program about being a beachcomber. No, I don't mean to suggest at all that happiness or the good life has to do with the accumulation of property at all. I'm just saying that today, for example, in the United States, depending on which one of the economists that you talk to, the federal government takes in taxes somewhere between 42–4% of our income goes to the government. So to that extent, you don't own 42, 3, 4, 5% of your property. That's what I meant. If it's taken away, you don't have the peaceful possession. You don't enjoy that. But the idea stems from, in America, one of the schemes here that separates our system from that of the Soviet Socialist Republic is the scheme of private ownership. And I think that the moral aspect of that that connection with the institution of freedom is not understood. I think that's the fault of people on my side of the fence, not on yours.
Well, it has been said that Adam Smith made greed respectable, and before Adam Smith, why Christians evidently were not encouraged to accumulate wealth, and that this became respectable with his philosophy, and that this did tend to make a distinction between those who, between the rich and the poor.
Well, that's been said, there's been said that Barry Goldwater was a warmonger in 1964. I think that your point, though, is well taken, that those things were said, but I think that now it's becoming more and more evident that such is not the case. And the spokesman on our side of the fence that explaining the ideas of freedom is understood by people on the individualist side of the fence are becoming better. And so I think that the question you raise is a good one. I think it's up to people on my side of the fence to make that clearer, but partly due to the good offices and the good nature of people on your side of the fence, and Tony here, and I'm pleased to be here to try to make a little dent in that thing if possible.
All right, I won't belabor it.
Dr. Wright.
Mr. Smead, on the first interview we had with you, you made the statement that you were very disenchanted with politics right now and were extremely interested in education. I know that that's one of the reasons why you're here in Coeur d'Alene. And I would assume that as president of the Center for the Study of Market Alternatives, which is in Boise, is that right?
Yes.
That maybe this is primarily, if not totally, an educational endeavor on your part. And I would like to pursue the idea here with you is exactly what is the Center for the Study of Market Alternatives. Could you tell us a little bit about it so our viewers would know? You know, here's a chance for you to make a
pitch?
A pitch.
Well, thanks, Ken. That's very much a part of the reason that I'm here in Coeur d'Alene, as you know, is to take part in an economic seminar that has to do with these ideas. It's one that's put on by the Foundation for Economic Education in Irvington, New York. The ideas promulgated by this foundation and by its founder, Leonard Read, have to do with the idea of the free market, private property, limited government approach to problem solving, and in a free society is a very keen interest to me. And as you say, I became disenchanted with politics a number of years ago and decided after the political bloodbath of 1964 that something was really amiss, and so I set out then to try to find out a better solution. And this particular foundation and the people associated with it have been very helpful in that. In that same tradition, some friends of mine and I have opened organized and opened the Center for Market Alternatives in Boise to try to articulate some positions. Hopefully they'll be listened to and hopefully understood. Now maybe they'll show up as legislation or the repeal, more hopefully, of legislation in Idaho and in the Intermountain area and wherever. But it's our idea to try to show that the marketplace and the free market is a scheme for problem solving that's just not generally understood, number one. It isn't talked about in the schools, and it's our idea to try to interest the idea of open-minded scholars, graduate students, and of politicians too, if you forgive the expression. Not all the politicians believe in more government, and not all of the ones that do believe in more government are necessarily bad, but we think the idea of market and the idea of Adam Smith's characterizations, he called it the invisible hand, is not understood, is indeed misunderstood. And it's our idea to try to make the distinction between capitalism and mercantilism, free market capitalism and state capitalism, like where the state owns the capital, like in Russia. And these people are not all bad. We think that the Center for Market Alternatives can be helpful in furnishing a place where those people who are interested in furthering their ideas, furthering their knowledge of the free market, can come and have access to a library and can break bread with other people of similar minds and of diverse opinion too as well. So it is indeed because of my interest in education and those of my colleagues that are associated therewith, and hopefully we'll receive some more interest. But a lot of that is the fault of the business community as well as the virtue. So I don't want you to think that it's a suggestion that our center will be to just push the idea that everybody, all the good guys, are on the side of business in the Chamber of Commerce. That's not what our intention.
Janelle Burke.
You have spoken several times about education in the previous program and also today. And so I would like to go directly to that area and ask you in what ways you think that education could be changed to give a broader viewpoint of diverse opinions, if that might be, at what levels you think this should be done. Who do you think should be the policy-making bodies in education? And then I'd like to go into the area with you of who should pay for education? How should it be paid for? Why not just private education for everyone? Playing the devil's advocate now. Why not just private education for everyone? And everyone decides where they're going to send their students. There is no such thing as public education. We all choose our own schools to send our, from first on through college ages. What would you think about an idea like that? You mentioned private contracts at the university level. Would you like to comment on some of those?
Oh, yes,
ideas?
indeed I would. It's kind of, it reminds me of what Winston Churchill said when some of the Women's Christian Temperance Union asked him if it was true that he had consumed enough brandy in his time to fill the room, which they were at the time up to that mark on the wall, and he looked up and pondered a bit, and he said, "Oh, so much to be done and so little time to do it in." But I think that's my response would be in the same order. But I think, Janelle, that in the first place, that we need to see education as a function of the government. The overwhelming bulk of education in America, as I'm sure you're aware, is a function of the government. And like the post office and other things here run by the government, depending on your own point of view, of course, are at least open to question. But in the area of education, we've come to look upon it as a kind of a religion. And it seems to me that about the first thing we could do was get the government out of education. That would be the best thing that we could do to begin with. But I don't say that to be against education. I say that out of a love of education. It seems to me that who should pay for education is who gets education. Now, we've educated a gigantic number of college students here since the Vietnam War, partly to help those young men, and of course the draft didn't apply to the women. I don't know just exactly what the Equal Rights Amendment will say to that, but it was a good gimmick to get out of going to Vietnam. And if you consider, to digress just a moment, I guess that's as good a reason as any to get out of one of those hamburger machines like Vietnam. So this isn't to condemn those young people who went to college to avoid the draft, but a lot of young people were herded into college that otherwise would have had very little interest. And so it seems to me that if we could dispel this blind faith in education, this almost religious fervor for education, an undefined kind of education, if you will, I think that would be the first thing, and I think probably the best vehicle to do that would be to get the government out of it. But there's no market feedback, it seems to me, in education, or very little. And if you have below-cost pricing in anything, raising wheat or whatever, you'll get a surplus. If the government makes up the difference, in other words, it's like Milton Friedman said one time about all us economists can do is show you how to have surpluses by having the government subsidize it. But I think that out of a zeal, in a friendly way, that this kind of blind faith has had an effect of having this utopian dream here. Well, at least we have the idea that a utopian dream can come about as a result of more and more education. If a little education is good, more is better, and even better than that is more and more. And so we now almost have cradle-to-grave education at government expense, below cost. And it seems to me that scholarships, for example, we take best students, certainly if you use a criterion to measure good students, we take those who are best able to fend for themselves, who have the best minds, and subsidize them. And an ordinary young person who might do well with some college education is somehow put in the background in order to make way for someone who has, academically speaking, a better chance. And so I'm not saying we should penalize someone who has a good mind and keep him out of school. I'm just saying that he has a better chance to get money to go to education through private means, or his own for that matter, than it would be an ordinary student who might do well if he were paying for his education. I think that the colleges then would respond in a market sense of the word to what they want. And then I think thereby that the college professors or the high school teachers would be rewarded. The most students would go to those teachers who were doing the best job in the opinion of those who were his customers, namely the students. But somehow or another, the market concept is offensive to an awful lot of college professors.
With that, Ralph, I want to break some new ground with you, and you're responsible for this. When I was discussing with you some weeks ago many subjects, you suggested that I read Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, and I'm reading a lot in those areas these days. And out of that came this kind of question, and I apologize for such a lengthy question, but I think this background is going to be necessary to get you going in this particular area, the way that what I'm seeking. When one looks at past history and contemporary times and then also projects or attempts to project into the future, I think one can come to this conclusion after reading that book. As I look backwards, I see many great philosophers that have written, starting with Plato and his idea of the real utopia and how it would come, and he made recommendations. Then Karl Marx came along and recommended the communist approach in socialism, and Adam Smith, that you have discussed, advocating laissez-faire. Adolf Hitler, although not in the same certainly area as some of those, advocated it was a super race and a super state. And when I think of all of these, and in some parts of the world their particular philosophies were tried for a period of time, it did not create a utopia. And then I think of organized religion and its role in the history of humans, in which many of the particular faiths have also advocated the answer, and yet we have great faith in denominational confrontations. We have religious wars, as we've been experiencing in Ireland and Lebanon, and the question of trying to legislate morality. When we look at the present time, too, I also note from statistics that I have such things as there are 140 multinational corporations in the United States that did in 1973 $380 billion worth of business. For example, General Motors had a larger business that year than the entire gross national product of South Africa. Some of the companies larger than certain small countries, big government, big universities, and so forth. Also, very recently, in viewing such things as a movie entitled Rollerball, we saw where there is projections of a technological, advanced society with bigness, and where the human becomes dehumanized and is caught up in all this trap. Now, with all that background, my question to you is the following. And do you perceive that from all of this, that what is the answer for human beings in this tremendous amount of frustration? And I'm referring again to Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, in which, at least if I interpret it correctly, that the author of that book was attempting to, I think, tell us that we're not using our minds to try to live the kind of life we can. In other words, statistics tell us that we use approximately 10% of our intelligence, and we retain about 10% of what is fed into our minds, and we also shy away from such things as parapsychology. Now, I know that's a very long question, but I'm very, very interested for our viewers in getting your comments at some length now on how you perceive your own philosophy and what is the answer to the humans in a philosophical sense in trying to grapple with what some of us feel is rather overwhelming.
In 25 words or less?
More than that, please.
Well, it seems to me what you're talking about, Tony, is centralization. Certainly as the government or the state gets bigger, individuals have to get smaller. Mathematical, or seems to be by definition. But as organizations get bigger, we can get centralization in big corporations as well. That seems to be what you're saying, and I agree. But whether or not, I don't know that cause and effect here are clearly defined. It seems to me that the big corporations that the liberals seem to think is a far greater menace than big government. At least the few assets that people in America, the middle class in America, which seems to be the guts, the real genius in America is the middle class, because it has up to now been rather huge. And it seemed to me, for it to preserve that organizations, whether they're big government or big business or big labor unions, somehow need to be, well, at least not rewarded. It seems to me that big labor or big corporations come about because of government. But I think that the prevailing mentality in America is that we need big government to protect us from the big corporations and from the big labor and from any other boogeymen that might come along, namely the capitalists. But, well, and I think that there may be some truth to that, to the extent that corporations engage in violence. But certainly, who's to protect us from the violence engaged in by the government? Now, the current investigations of the CIA and of the FBI and other organizations, of course, it's interesting. It seems to me that another big organization that almost totally escapes scrutiny is the IRS. But certainly some has been written in popular journals about the harassment and the arrogance of the Internal Revenue Service. But somehow or another, Senator Church and his colleagues, and certainly it isn't all the Democrats either, some of the Republicans haven't made very much noise about it either, don't feel quite the same uneasiness toward these organizations, these huge organizations, whether they're big corporations or big business, so long as they're not engaged in a profit in a seeking venture. And it seems to me that if a free society like ours, predicated on private ownership and on capital, on private ownership of capital too, and it seems to me that's the underpinning, certainly a big underpinning of our society. And of all the non-utopian dreams we ought to have, it seems the first thing we ought not to do is to reward, through government intervention, the promulgation of big corporations or big labor unions or, well, big government seems to be. I'm not sure whether big government comes about because of the corporations or in spite of them, but it seems to me that a lot, the corporation lobbyists, for example, get back to Washington, D.C., and whether it's out of frustration that they go to Washington, for example, the National Association of Manufacturers and the National Chamber of Commerce both were right down there to Washington, D.C. when wage and price controls were being considered by the Nixon administration, advocating. Well, gosh, you know, with enemies like that, you know, with friends like that, who needs enemies? And it just seems to me that corporation lobbyists, that trade organizations per se, go down, everybody's got an office in Washington, D.C., to go down to get the government to do something for them, namely to keep their competitors from entering the market. So it seems to me that if this super centralization that you're talking about is to be coped with, dealt with in any meaningful way, that the first thing we got to do is stop rewarding centralization through these avenues by the offices of government, by their interventionisms. It seems to me that the multinational corporations, for example, a lot. I talked to Frank Church about this one time in Boise here a couple of years ago, and he was talking about these bad guys that had fled the homeland and gone overseas and to make their profit and seek their purposes overseas. It was kind of running out, taking their money over there and so on, and he thought that was bad. And I said, Frank, wouldn't it be helpful if we said, if we looked at this also another way and said, now, what do you think about the big corporations that have been driven overseas because of harassment? It seems by the government. It's an interesting thing that the popular mentality today says we shouldn't intervene in Angola, we shouldn't intervene in Vietnam, and we shouldn't intervene in NATO, and we shouldn't intervene elsewhere. But these very same people want to intervene to beat the band here at home, particularly in the economic circles. And this would seem to be mainly the liberal mentality, although I think there's quite a lot of Republicans that are in that, maybe behind the scenes too. I know some of them that are. But what you talk about is centralization. And when you get centralization, the individual goes down as the organization goes up, whether it's big government or big corporations or big labor unions. And it's got to come about, seems to me, in education. But educators are generally, on the whole, not familiar with the workings of the marketplace. Certainly, they're not familiar with the workings of the free market. Now, we've got a lot of marketplace that's not free. You have the monopolies of the telephone company, you have the monopolies of the power companies, the monopolies of the gas companies, and of course they're state-sanctioned monopolies. But Milton Friedman, I think, makes a real good case. And I think he treats the problem that you raise, I think, rather well in his book, Capitalism and Freedom. I think that he makes the point there that monopolies, for example, can rarely last in any significant length of time, except in the presence of government intervention to hold their monopolistic position. That competition will rise. They get to making too much money, somebody else enters that market, provided we keep the market free and preserve the institution of free entry in the market. And it seems to me that to the extent that college professors have academic freedom, and I don't know that it's altogether free either. We have this affirmative action program now. I understand that some of you people in the college business find difficult to agree with. But now you're getting government intervention in your area, and it tickles me to death. But I don't say that it's malicious. I don't say that those people who want affirmative action don't want the good life, you see. But the idea that a lot of college people think that it's the audacity of some bureaucrat that wants to come and infringe on my academic freedom. Well, gosh, he didn't give a damn about the corporation or the family